Welcome to the History Guy Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories of lesser-known historical events told by Lance Geiger, also known as the History Guy on YouTube. I'm Josh, your host, a writer for the channel and eldest son of the History Guy. We tell all kinds of stories about history, from the modern era to the ancient past, so you never know what we're going to talk about next. One thing you can be sure of, it is history that deserves to be remembered. We at The History Guy are also excited to announce a new way to interact with the team and the History Guy himself at Locals.com. Join the History Guy Guild for your one-stop location to chat with other history fans, get updates on the team, and more. You can join for free or pay as little as $5 a month to get access to live chats with the History Guy, looks behind the scenes, early access to ad-free videos, and more. Find us at historyguyguild.locals.com. We look forward to seeing you there. On today's episode, the History Guy talks about some contributions of women to the war effort in World War II. First, he tells the story of the Women's Air Force Service pilots, who put their lives on the line to help the country in a perilous time. Then he talks about Virginia Hall, the Allies' most dangerous spy, and her incredible spycraft in wartime France. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
It was December 7th, 1941, over the Hawaiian island of Oahu, and the civilian pilot instructor was up in the air with their regular student when they saw a warplane coming their direction. It was coming at them so fast that the instructor had to take control of the plane from the student and open the throttle in order to avoid a head-on collision. The plane went underneath them so close that the instructor said the celluloid windows were rattling violently. The instructor managed to safely land the plane, but two other civilian instructors who went up that day, not knowing that they were flying into a war, never returned. Like so many after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, that instructor wanted to join the military and get their revenge. They wrote in a magazine article in June of 1943, each of us had some individual score to settle against the Japs, who had brought death and destruction to our islands. But that pilot instructor, Cornelia Fort, could not easily join the military to get her revenge, because at the time the U.S. military did not accept women pilots. When she got her chance, she jumped at it. She said, "I knew that I was going to join the Women Auxiliary Flying Squadron before the organization was a reality, before it had a name, before it was anything more than a radical idea." Cornelia Clark Fort was one of more than 1,000 women who joined an organization that would eventually be known as the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASP, and their service deserves to be remembered. Bessie Lee Pittman was born in Florida in 1936, the youngest of 5 children. She married at just the age of 13. Marriage broke up after the death of their son at age 5, but she kept her married name, went by the name Jacqueline Cochran. She had a strong personal drive, which might be part of the reason that she tried to distance herself from her humble roots. She became a hairdresser in New York and started to develop her own line of cosmetics. There she met a wealthy industrialist, Floyd Odlum, who bankrolled her cosmetic business. But Jackie Cochran had another interest. In 1932, a friend offered her a ride in an aircraft, and she was hooked. She took flight lessons, became a qualified pilot. She and Odlum married in 1935 and used her flying skills to help market her cosmetics under the title Wings to Beauty. She entered flying competitions, became friends with many of the famous aviators of the day, including Amelia Earhart. By 1939, she was one of the most famous women pilots in America. Knowing the U.S. was already building up its forces in anticipation of war, she approached Eleanor Roosevelt to suggest the possibility of using women as ferry pilots in wartime. Her idea was initially refused by the U.S. Army Air Corps. She went to England and served with the British Air Transport Auxiliary, which took women pilots for ferrying duties, and helped recruit experienced American female pilots to fly for the ATA. Born on Valentine's Day, 1914, Nancy Harkness took an interest in aviation at a young age, taking her first flight at age 16, and earning her private pilot's license the same year. In school, she was once suspended for buzzing the nearby boys' school in her plane. At the age of 18, she earned her commercial license. She married Robert M. Love, an Air Corps Reserve major, in 1936. They built a successful aviation company. She competed in national air races and became a test pilot for the Gwin Air Car Company, where she helped to develop the tricycle landing system. She first approached the Army Air Corps with the idea of using women pilots to ferry aircraft in 1940, suggesting that women pilots be made part of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, or the WACS. But there were technical issues with the suggestion, and as with Cochran's suggestion, the time may simply not have been ripe yet. As Chief of the Air Force, General Hap Arnold was quoted as saying, "The use of women pilots serves no military purpose in a country which has adequate manpower at this time." But after the outbreak of war, it became clear that qualified women pilots could play a valuable role flying aircraft in non-combat duties, freeing male pilots for combat. Both Cochrane and Love submitted proposals. Cochrane became head of the Women's Flying Training Detachment, or WFTD, to train women pilots, while Love recruited already qualified pilots into the Women Auxiliary Fearing Squadron, or WAFS. Among her first recruits was Cornelia Fort. She noted, "We have no hopes of replacing men pilots, but we can each release a man to combat, to faster ships, to overseas work. Delivering a trainer to Texas can be as important as delivering a bomber to Africa, if you take the long view." The military seemed to agree, but only up to a point. The WASP were not soldiers. They were not officers like many who flew with the Air Transport Command. They were civilian contractors. Efforts to militarize the WASP faced not just procedural issues, but also opposition from members of Congress and the press who thought the idea of training women pilots to be a waste of resources. And while the WASP did the exact same duty as men who also served as civilian ferry pilots, the WASP were paid at 2/3 the rate of their male counterparts. The point was made dreadfully clear on March 7, 1943. Margie Sanford Oldenburg had become a flying enthusiast after meeting Amelia Earhart. She had graduated from the University of California and married a Marine ensign. According to the Oakland Tribune on February 7, 1943, she already had flight instruction at local airports and advanced training in Nevada when she left to become Berkeley's first representative to the Women Auxiliary Ferry Squadron. She went for training with Jackie Cochrane's WFTD in Texas. On March 7th, she was training with a male instructor pilot, Norris Morgan, when their Fairchild PT-19 trainer failed to recover from a spin during spin training. She was the first trainee fatality in the program. As she wasn't officially in the military, she wasn't entitled to a military funeral. Jackie Cochrane paid for her funeral out of her pocket. It was a stark reminder that the air service was dangerous, even to those who did not serve in combat. And a second reminder came just 2 weeks later. On March 21st, Cornelia Fort was ferrying Vultee BT-13 Valiant trainers to Dallas Love Field, along with 6 newly trained male pilots. One of the other pilots clipped her left wing with his landing gear, tearing off the wingtip and 6 feet of its leading edge. The plane hit the ground vertically so hard that the engine was buried 2 feet into the ground. The pilot who had survived the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was the first woman pilot to die on war duty in American history. She was just 25 years old. Shortly before her death, she had sent a letter to the magazine The Woman's Home Companion, detailing her experience at Pearl Harbor and her reason for joining the WAFs. The letter was published that June. The editor wrote, "Her words here will live as moving account of why one woman joined the WAFs, and as a testament to all American women who are helping to keep America free." In August 1943, the WFTD and the WAFS were combined to form the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASP. The training was difficult. More than 25,000 women applied for the WASP, but only 1,830 were accepted into the program. Of those, only 1,074 earned their coveted silver wings.
For men, it would be tough. It's tough for girls, too.
Among the first set of pilots was Catherine Rawls Thompson, who was an Olympic silver medalist in diving and had once been one of the world's top swimmers. Having qualified as a pilot when the 1940 Olympics were canceled due to the war, she decided to join the WASP. A WASP graduated with a commercial pilot's license and an instrument rating. They passed Army Air Force regulations and had the equivalent of a college aeronautical degree. They received essentially the same training as male Army Air Corps pilots. By graduation, WASP recruits had 560 hours of ground school and 210 hours of flight training. The WASP played a significant role in ferrying aircraft for the Air Transport Service. Over the course of the program, WASP logged 60 million miles and delivered 12,650 aircraft, representing 78 different types, to bases throughout the nation. Evelyn Sharp, who went by the name Sharpie, had grown up in Nebraska. She had made her first solo flight at just age 15, as one of the nation's first female airmail pilots, and had trained more than 350 pilots before becoming one of the first 23 women to join the WAFs, a group known as the Originals. By 1944, she was one of the most experienced of the WASP, a squadron commander who had ferried over 150 different planes of 18 different types. On April 3rd, she was ferrying a P-38 Lightning. Just 1 minute after takeoff, one of the plane's 2 engines failed. For many pilots, the remaining engine would have torqued the plane over and into the ground, but Evelyn jammed the rudder to counter the effect and turned the plane back towards the field. She pancaked the P-38 for a wheels-up landing. The plane was not badly damaged, but Evelyn's neck was broken. She was 24 years old. The airport at Ord, Nebraska is called Sharp Field in her memory. The Wasp flew every type of mission any Air Force male pilot flew during World War II except combat. They took the duty many male pilots refused, serving as test and drone pilots and instrument and link instructors. They flew tracking and searchlight missions, towed gliders and targets, and delivered weapons, cargo, and personnel. It is ironic that women who were prevented from flying in combat, ostensibly to protect them, were often given dangerous tasks that male pilots were afraid to fly. Towing targets was especially dangerous, and their planes were often hit by fire. Several Wasps received wounds. The planes used for towing were often poorly equipped and maintained. At Camp Davis in North Carolina, there were 14 accidents involving improperly maintained towing planes, resulting in the death of 2 Wasps. In June 1944, the bill to give the Wasp military status failed in Congress by 19 votes. By that time, the nation had gone from a pilot shortage to having more volunteers than they could train. Pilot training commissioning schools were being reduced, and some males seeking to become pilots complained that training women was preventing the training of more combat pilots. Arnold had pressed Congress to either commission the women or disband the program. Congress chose the latter. In June, the House Committee on Civil Service reported that the program had become unnecessary. The program was officially disbanded December 20th, 1944. Some women from the program offered to continue to ferry planes for essentially no pay, but were still refused. Despite their contribution, the Wasps were not well known at the time or for many years thereafter. Like many military programs, the records of the Wasps were classified and sealed for 35 years. And their contributions and lives are just now being discovered by historians. While the Wasps were experienced pilots, many of them had difficulty finding employment in aviation at the time. Civilian airlines didn't hire female pilots. They said that public opinion wouldn't allow it. In 1949, the Air Force offered commissions to the Wasps, but those that accepted were put in administrative roles. They weren't allowed to be pilots. The U.S. military didn't start accepting women pilots until 1974, and then the first one wasn't even with the Air Force. It was an Army helicopter pilot. The Air Force did not start accepting women into pilot training until 1976, and they weren't accepted into fighter pilot training until 1993. In 1948, Nancy Harkness Love was made a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force Reserve. She worked tirelessly, seeking recognition for the Wasp. She passed away due to cancer in 1976 at the age of 62. In 1953, Jackie Cochran piloted a Canadair Sabre borrowed from the Royal Canadian Air Force to become the first woman pilot to pilot a supersonic aircraft. She set numerous records and firsts for women pilots. She passed away in 1980 at the age of 74. In 1979, congressional legislation was finalized, so veteran status and military recognition and benefits were granted to the Wasp. In 2009, President Barack Obama and the United States Congress awarded the Wasp the Congressional Gold Medal. The Commemorative Air Force, an organization that was founded to acquire, restore, and preserve in flying condition a complete collection of combat aircraft, which were flown by all military services of the United States, and selected aircraft of other nations, for the education and enjoyment of present and future generations of Americans, had restored an AT-6A aircraft that was used to train Wasp. The CAF tours the nation with the plane as part of their CAF Rise Above Wasp program. The program's mission is to share the story of the women Air Force service pilots in order to inspire others, especially girls and young women, to rise above expectations and find a greater appreciation of their potential. In addition to serving vital wartime functions and freeing more than 1,000 pilots for combat duty, the Wasp has served to inspire generations of women to careers in aviation. On December 7, 1944, General Arnold spoke to the last Wasp class to graduate. He said, "You and more than 900 of your sisters have proven that you can fly wingtip to wingtip with your brothers. If ever there was doubt that women can become skillful pilots, the Wasp have dispelled that doubt."
Now's the part of the episode where we get to chat with the history guy. A little bit about what we just heard, what we're going to hear, and some behind-the-scenes stuff you only get to hear about on the podcast. So the opening of this episode, where you start talking about Pearl Harbor, is in itself a really, really interesting story. I had never really considered, or not often considered, that there might be civilians in the air at Pearl Harbor, just caught up in the middle of it.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people know that, and it's kind of hard to tell on Pearl Harbor if the Japanese were deliberately targeting civilians. They did shoot at some vehicles on the ground, but apparently they certainly showed no qualms in shooting down clearly civilian aircraft, because those aircraft might have warned, Pearl Harbor that they were coming. And so, they were just caught in the air in their little Piper Cub, I would imagine, and then Zeros were with them.
They didn't stand a chance.
So, it is an interesting story, but it also is interesting because, that's her motive for joining up was so similar to the motives that anybody had for joining up. She had relevant skills, and yet had difficulty finding a spot. And then also, of course, later on, she dies as part of the WAFs, I think. But it's a story that would totally make sense if it was a man, but it's more of a surprise because it's a woman. And first and foremost, these are heroes. They were like anybody at the time. They saw the cause as being larger than themselves. They took great risk upon themselves to serve that larger cause. But it's interesting because it's not even that they didn't have to go. I mean, certainly they weren't drafted. It's that they had to struggle to get people to let them go. And that in itself is kind of unique. I mean, it was hard even to volunteer, and yet they did.
Yeah, there were lots of ways that women helped on the home front, but this was a step beyond that, because they did have to push into, even not in the combat roles, but into roles that involved them in the military at all.
It's so comic to me that it was too dangerous to send a woman into combat, but they would let them fly rickety, ill-repaired airplanes that were towing targets for anti-aircraft guys. They didn't know how to shoot their anti-aircraft guns yet. I guess their planes got hit rather frequently, and that was fine. But you couldn't go into combat.
It seems like there's a disconnect there somewhere. I'm not sure that.
Throughout. The biggest question always was, do we really need this extra pool? Didn't we have plenty of pilots as it was? And I think they just wanted to contribute. But that was a question that always was difficult with Congress, is to say, we got plenty of people who want to fly the airplanes, So you could say every WASP that was, in part of the transport command, that freed a pilot that could go fight in combat. But in the end, they had more than enough pilots of every type. And it just wasn't perceived then that it's like, oh, we're just wasting our money training women just to say that we had girls. So it's like they really weren't appreciated at all in their time, and really weren't appreciated by Congress until 2000, until 2008, when they were finally recognized in the Obama administration.
It is. That's unfortunately often the story. You get these places and these women had to push so hard, and with people who were clearly didn't really want to deal with them. They didn't want these women involved, and even once they did, they didn't want to involve them actually in the Army or give them. They didn't want to pay them, and it's hard to imagine. Those were conditions that deliberately were trying to push them into just.
And especially at the beginning of the war, when there was a shortage of pilots, a lot of these women were already qualified pilots. Hap Arnold believed in them, but Hap Arnold finally told either make them regular officers or just give up. It doesn't make sense. And I don't think that he expected that their answer would be, well, we're just going to give up then. We don't need them. So, it's all an interesting story, but certainly they contributed in extraordinary ways. They took extraordinary risks. Some of them gave all. They did that for their country. And they certainly proved that they could, once you're behind a cockpit, it doesn't make a difference, really, if you're a man or a woman. Some of them, I think, were very accomplished pilots, but they also played large roles, say, in training. We made the episode on the Aztec Eagles, which was a Mexican P-47 unit that served in the Pacific. It's the only time that Mexico's had a military unit serve outside the Republic. When they were training, their instrument training was done by WASPs. That was true everywhere. I was at the Yankee Air Museum with wonderful people up there in Michigan, and they had one of the trainers and a big picture of it. It's a little wooden box trainer, the big picture of it, and it's a WASP that's doing the training. So they played all sorts of important aviation roles, and they did that despite the fact that they literally had to fight for the chance. And even when they canceled the WASP, some of them were saying, just let me fly. You don't got to pay me.
They just wanted to do their part, and they had. It's interesting because if they were men, they would have accepted them happily. It wouldn't have been about.
Oh yeah, they were desperate for pilots at the beginning of the war.
Women pilots are still fairly rare, I think. I'm not sure what the numbers look like, but
that's certainly different now because we trained women combat pilots and we've had women bomber pilots, and it took a very long time for that to change. And again, the first U.S. military female pilot was actually a helicopter pilot with the Army. It was a long time before the Air Force started letting women fly. And you know, I don't want to focus on the fact that they were women. You want to focus on the fact that they were only volunteers. Not one of them was drafted or forced to do what they did, and that they took on the most dangerous duty that other pilots were afraid to take on. And they did so because they wanted to contribute. And gosh, maybe they just really loved flying. I mean, we hear that from a lot of pilots.
Yeah.
A lot of the World War II pilots is that they loved being up there and they loved the freedom of the sky. And maybe, you know, these women did too. And so because of that, they were willing to take on
Well, and
anything.
it makes sense. You know, when you're looking at how you can help the country, and you've got a specialized skill like that, which is even at the beginning of the war in demand, you can see why they thought that was their best way to help. I mean, in some ways, you know, it's too bad that we didn't take advantage of it. In other ways, it's what it was. But it's certainly them individually.
Well, I mean, you can contrast this with the story we did on the Night Witches. You know, the Soviets just put women in the most dangerous planes and let them go into combat because, you know, their homeland was at risk. So we were still, I think, trying to maintain this vision of normalcy that said that we don't risk women in combat. But I mean, there were plenty of women who simply wanted to be a part of the cause, and this whole episode's about that too, because Virginia Hall certainly qualifies as that too. So I would say that they're first and foremost simply heroes because they were willing to put their life at risk for a cause they thought was bigger than them, and they worked very difficult, you know, took on very difficult circumstances to do that. But then you also have the fact that they had to fight to even be allowed the opportunity to do that, and that's something that's just kind of different. Most of the heroes that we talk about in the Second World War, you know, they didn't have to go, you know, fight in order to be drafted or fight in order to get into a unit. Most of them, you know, were, you know, that wasn't the issue. I mean, it was the issue is what they did under fire.
And not to say that they weren't heroic, but it is a different situation. Is that for some people, and I'm sure for a lot of women too, once you hit that resistance, I mean, it's very easy to say, well, I tried, and that's good enough. And they went beyond that.
But you know, on the other hand, they had always far more women applying for the WASP than they could get in. So I mean, there was never the shortage. There were always just more women who wanted to do it, and you know, I think they saw the adventure in it and the importance in it, and they wanted to be a part of the cause. There's a lot of, you know, ways that women contributed on the home front, but I always remember there's this old World War II Coast Guard film that I've stumbled on a couple of times when we were making episodes, it was talking about the Coast Guard Auxiliary, the Women's Coast Guard Auxiliary, and there's a line in this that says, "You might not get to be an admiral, but you could be an admiral's secretary," and it makes me laugh because that line was totally sincere. There's nothing tongue in cheek about it at the time, and you know, now if you made that line,
comes straight from
a
satire film. That's
and that one there, you know, they were that's their joke about how things were. So, and that's not to say that you still don't face obstacles in the workforce today. I don't know. I've never been a woman in the workforce, but certainly it was a different level of obstacle then. But they kept their spirit and their morale in the face of all these obstacles, in the face of them doing everything they could, make sure they had the worst quarters and the worst food, and the lowest pay, gave them the worst airplanes, and they just continued to fight for the ability to make the difference that they knew that they could make. And in the end, it's awfully hard to say that they didn't make a significant difference. If you look at the number of hours in flight, and if you equivalent that with the number of hours that we would have taken away from our combat pilots to have to do that flight, it's extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary.
And it's all because they were willing to push for it. You know, on a kind of similar note in terms of how difficult it was for them to get into the air. We've done a number of episodes about some early women pilots, like early into the whole aviation industry. And we did one on like Mary Marvinkt, who is she was in like the first 5 women.
Yes, it's extraordinary.
And then Bessie Coleman, who had to leave the United States to get, and that was...
Yeah, it's a black Native American woman and just couldn't get, they wouldn't even let her into flight school in the US, so she had to go get her license over in France, and was one of the first,
And in some ways, you know, the stories you tell about some of these women, things had improved so much. It was easier for them to get a pilot's license than it was.
If you want to complain about the glass ceiling today, certainly it is easier to become a pilot as a female today than it was in 1920 or 1910 or 1940. I don't think anybody really questions that.
It's amazing how that moved makes, even into
this person all the more extraordinary that they were willing to break that boundary. So I kind of hate to focus on that because you want to focus on the fact that someone's just a heroic human. But you can't step past the fact that it took something extra to be able to break the boundaries that had always been placed there before, and that's what you would say about the WASP.
I agree, and it's hard to you don't want to make this story about it's only special because they were women.
It's only special because they're girls.
This is a remarkable story of sacrifice and of a desire to help their country in a time of need.
You could write that. I think we did do one on the Air Transport Command. I mean, there were a lot of these pilots that were behind the scenes and never flew in combat, but they were flying with a hump, or they were flying the bombers over to North Africa or something like that. And it took a lot of risk. It's stunning when you hear how many of the Army Air Force died in training, because these are not easy to operate machines. All sorts of navigational errors, all sorts of stuff goes on. So, I mean, you were taking risks just to do that. And so, you can just look at that and say, this is part of what you hear from the WASP, is just the whole idea that the stuff that we never even thought about, like once the airplane's built, how does it get to some place where they can fly it against a German or a Japanese, opponent? That those people are taking real risk, and a lot of them, didn't come home.
And it was important work, logistics is the boring part of war, but it's a rather significant part of it. You're fighting,
and in many ways heroic. There's always risks that are being taken, and you find that in a number of different ways. And this is one of the places that you find it. I can't imagine anybody who would want to volunteer to be the plane that drags the target for he's never fired the anti-aircraft gun before. So what you're going to do is fly around in the air and see can he hit the thing behind you and not hit you. I don't think anybody wanted that duty except for the WASP.
They were willing to fly that despite injuries, and they all knew that everyone knew that even flying the plane recreationally was dangerous. Still is today, of course.
But even if you're a careful pilot, and of course, a lot of these high performance fighter aircraft, bomber aircraft of the Second World War were very difficult to fly, and a lot of more notoriously difficult to fly, and yet they were flying.
Yeah, and they flew every kind of plane that anyone in combat flew. They didn't fly it in combat, but they flew on all kinds of them.
Yeah, every sort of airplane we had, they flew, and a lot of those planes were very difficult to fly.
Magellan TV is sponsoring this episode, and they sponsor all of our podcasts. And if you've listened to the podcast, you know that what we like to do is talk about what we've been watching on Magellan TV lately. And so what have you been watching on Magellan TV?
I had the most fun. I watched a space one that says, is the universe infinite? And it's an interesting question. And actually it was something that I wish I'd thought of for the history guy. It's a question talking about the history of that whole idea of infinity. Which was really a controversial concept. And matter of fact, it even goes into there's some modern science questioning the idea that the universe is infinite. That there's some, and so it goes from, initially, one of the ancient Greeks was thrown overboard and drowned because he suggested that pi was an infinite number. And they were so offended by the very idea. Galileo had to recant his argument that the universe was infinite and the solar system. So he had to literally, apologize or be killed by the Inquisition. It was under house arrest for years because that was apostasy. So it's really, it tells the whole story. One of the things I liked the best is they were talking about the infinite monkeys story. If you put an infinite number of monkeys in front of infinite number of typewriters, they'll have it. If you give an infinite number of random chance, one of the monkeys is going to write Shakespeare, right? And the way that they were illustrating that is they had a dude in a monkey suit playing on a computer, and it's clearly a monkey suit. And I've just never seen them actually try to visualize it that way. But they do a really good job of dumbing it down for non-scientists like me and making these concepts easy to understand, and then talking about the history of the whole concept of can something be infinite. I had a really great time. It's one of the reasons I love Magellan TV. You never know what you're going to stumble into. And there's so much that you could watch, and that was just something I stumbled on, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. What have you been watching recently on Magellan TV?
So, I did a true crime recently, and it was one I hadn't heard of. It is called Crossbow Killer, and it is about it's about a murder in South Africa, Cape Town. What happened is this body that was it looks like he'd been underwater for a long time, I guess, was horribly bloated and very, very badly damaged, and had a crossbow bolt through his head. And so they were very confused when they found him. But it's a really interesting case, and it has to do with his wife, who had her first husband died, and within 4 months she was married to this guy. She's apparently still alive today, and not in prison. She got early release, which is interesting. I don't know, even though it appears that she.
So if you're spoiling it here, she shot him through the head with a crossbow.
Well, that part they actually don't make much of a secret of. But there's some interesting stuff that goes around they do pretty much from the beginning. They're like,
there's plenty of mystery involved, but I mean, why the choice of that particular type of murder is an interesting.
Yeah, and they kind of talk about some of that.
I don't have a crossbow. I mean, people see the cabinet of curiosities that are behind me, and I don't have. Maybe
there's
I need to get one.
There's still some question about whether she had an accomplice or not. And so the stuff that they talk about with it is actually really, really, really interesting. And there's some crazy stuff they do with
That's very sexist. Are they asserting that she couldn't load a crossbow just because she's a girl?
They said she wasn't strong enough to have actually loaded the crossbow,
maybe she got their husband to load it for her. She's like, "How does this thing work? Show me." And then boom.
Not to spoil the whole thing, there's a lot of really, really interesting stuff and kind of how this case works out. But it's something else.
That is Magellan TV, and you never know what you're going to stumble. Who would have guessed that what you're going to stumble on Magellan TV is a documentary about the woman who murdered her husband?
Yeah, and then dumped him in a river. So if you're into true crime and you like watching that kind of stuff,
there's a lot of true crime on
Absolutely.
Magellan TV, and if you love true crime, you're not going to find more of it anywhere. Yeah.
And of course, if you are a listener or watcher of The History Guy, you can always go to try.magellantv.com/historyguy, where we will always have a deal for you. Sometimes a free month, or a deal on an annual membership, or even a documentary that you can watch for free. Again, that's try.magellantv.com/historyguy. Next up, The History Guy tells of the heroic efforts of Virginia Hall, the Allies' most dangerous spy.
There was a spy whom the Axis considered to be one of the most dangerous Allied spies of the Second World War, who organized a network of thousands in the French resistance, who managed to escape being hunted by the Gestapo many times, who was responsible for acts of sabotage against the Axis, for jailbreaks, for critical intelligence gathering in wartime France. One step ahead of the enemy, the spy managed to escape across the mountains in winter, a feat that would have been difficult for anyone, but was particularly remarkable for a woman with a wooden leg. The exploits of the daring and audacious spy, Virginia Hall, were almost lost to history, but her story deserves to be remembered. Virginia was born to a rich Maryland family in Baltimore in 1906. She was raised and educated in order to marry into the wealthy social circle of her peers, but Virginia was different. She wanted adventure and liked to hunt. She called herself capricious and cantankerous. Her classmates voted the young Virginia the most original in her class. They wrote in the yearbook, "The one thing to expect from Dindy," their nickname for Virginia, "is the unexpected." She was class president, editor-in-chief of the newspaper, and captain of the field hockey team. In a nod to her future career path, Virginia also practiced being someone else and acted in school plays. Clinging fiercely to her individuality, Virginia told her high school graduating class that the one way for women to get ahead was by being educated. She followed her own advice by attending Radcliffe and Barnard colleges, finishing her studies in Europe, where she fell in love with the continent. Wanting to stay, she tried to enter the Foreign Service at a time when only 6 U.S. diplomats were women. She was denied entry to the Foreign Service, but found work in the same field as a clerk in the consular office in Poland in 1931. Virginia later worked in many consular offices throughout Europe. She had been an active person as a child and young adult, but in 1932 she was climbing over a wire fence while bird hunting and accidentally discharged her shotgun into her left leg. Her leg had to be amputated below her knee because of gangrene, and she used a wooden prosthetic for the rest of her life. She nicknamed the prosthetic Cuthbert. It weighed 7 pounds and was attached by leather belts wrapped around her waist. While she dreamed of a diplomatic career, Virginia ran into obstacles as a woman of her time. She applied again to the Foreign Service, but this time was rejected because of her leg. She couldn't advance any further in the consular service as a woman and resigned in 1939, while Europe teetered on the brink of the Second World War. Virginia happened to be in Paris when the war began. She volunteered to drive an ambulance and was in France when it fell to the Nazis in the summer of 1940. France was split in two, with Vichy France as the nominal government of southern France, while Germans occupied northern and western France. While escaping back to Great Britain, a chance encounter on the train out of France led Virginia to her life of espionage. On the train, she met an operative working as a British spy who gave her the contact information of some friends in London. Later, she was at a cocktail party ranting about the dangers of Hitler and Nazis when a woman gave her a business card. She said, "If you're really interested in stopping Hitler, come and see me." Virginia had met Vera Atkins, who was a British spy master. The British government formed the Special Operations Executive in the summer of 1940. Its mission was to conduct espionage, sabotage, and reconnaissance in occupied Europe and to aid local resistance movements. Prime Minister Winston Churchill's command to the SOE was to set Europe ablaze. Vera Atkins supervised Virginia and the work of 36 other female agents. Escaping from growing anti-Semitism in Romania, Atkins, a Jewish woman, immigrated to Britain in 1937. She joined the SOE in 1941 as a secretary and then assistant to French section head Colonel Maurice Buckmaster. She recruited and deployed British agents to occupied France and was supposedly the inspiration for Moneypenny in Ian Fleming's James Bond novels. Virginia Hall was highly educated. She spoke French, Italian, and German, something that was useful to the SOE. Atkins was also impressed with her intimate knowledge of the French countryside. Atkins took her into the SOE, where she received training, and in 1941 was deployed to France, one of the SOE's first agents in the region. Virginia's primary mission was to provide SOE with information on Vichy France, including political developments, economic conditions, and who had the will to resist. Instead, she became adept at recruiting a spy network. The network, codenamed Heckler, became a logistical hub, recruiting agents and coordinating their sabotage activities. In addition, it provided intelligence on troop movements, ammunition and fuel depots, and industrial production. She then spent over a year coordinating resistance activities in Vichy France and occupied France, in Toulouse and Lyon. Part of Virginia's success could be attributed to the chauvinism of the Nazis early in the war, because they did not think that a woman could be an effective spy. In Lyon, Virginia started her networking activities by staying at a convent. She befriended a brothel owner and received information from prostitutes who were friendly with the occupying German troops. She set up safe houses for those working in her network and developed a specialty in jailbreaks, helped by prison guards who accepted bribes. Virginia assisted noted SOE operative Peter Churchill in several of his missions in occupied France during 1942. He delivered cash, ration books, and identity documents for forgers in an effort to get resistance members released. Churchill later ran a network in Cannes and having narrowly escaped the Gestapo. Spies in occupied France did not have advanced technology. Instead, they relied on ingenuity to deliver the information to their handlers. For example, the BBC inserted coded messages into its nightly broadcasts. Virginia used the cover identity of a reporter for the New York Post. She filed news stories with her editor in New York, embedded with coded messages, which the editor passed on to London. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed by the Nazis, however, and they realized the extent of the damage that could be caused by a female spy. She racked up quite the resume: agents freed from Nazi prisons, acts of sabotage against railroads and factories, and causing the disappearance of Nazi pilots who had parachuted out. In short, she followed Churchill's command to set Europe ablaze. The Gestapo investigated, and all the trails led to Lyon. They opened a file on Virginia. The French called her La Dame qui Boit, the lady who limps, but the Nazis sought her as the limping lady in their most wanted list. She continually changed her appearance, keeping them guessing as to what she looked like and where she might strike next. And she was responsible for more jailbreaks, acts of sabotage, and intelligence regarding troop movements than almost any other spy of the Second World War. She was pursued by none other than Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon. He ordered wanted posters that had a drawing of her with the words, "The enemy's most dangerous spy. We must find and destroy her." The drawing was of a sharp-featured woman with shoulder-length hair and wide-set eyes, details obtained from French double agents. The Nazis incorrectly believed Virginia was Canadian, and Barbie once said, "I'd give anything to lay my hands on that limping Canadian." He was convinced that capturing her would further his career. In November 1942, Nazis suddenly seized all of France. The Vichy regime remained in power, but collaborated with the Nazis. Virginia knew she needed to get out if she was going to survive. She had previously helped Peter Churchill escape to Spain by accompanying him on a train because couples aroused less suspicion. For her own escape, she fled from Lyon to Perpignan. Then she walked over a 7,500-foot pass in the Pyrenees to Spain. Virginia covered 50 miles in 2 days with a wooden leg, sometimes walking through snow. She messaged her handlers that she was okay, but Cuthbert was giving her trouble. Not understanding that she was referring to her prosthetic, they told her, "If Cuthbert is giving you difficulty, have him eliminated." Writing in 2017 in the Studies of Intelligence Journal, Craig Galley reported he found the pass Virginia used during her daring wartime escape. At the time, the French called it Chemin de la Liberté, a freedom trail linking France to Spain that many refugees used. It is now unmarked and its importance lost to time. Repeating Virginia's journey, Galley said it would have been a difficult trek for an experienced hiker and an exceptional feat for Virginia, a woman with a prosthetic leg. After her death-defying trek, Spanish authorities arrested Virginia for illegal entry, and she was imprisoned for 6 weeks. She was released after a freed inmate smuggled a letter from her to the U.S. consulate in Barcelona. She did some further work for the SOE in Spain, returning to London in 1943. The next year, she joined the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, which was established by the U.S. government in 1942 to collect and analyze information and conduct special operations. Virginia wanted to return to action in France in 1944, and they were keen to let her. She landed in Brittany in a British torpedo boat and eluded the Gestapo by disguising herself as an old peasant woman. Virginia got a makeup artist to teach her how to draw wrinkles on her face and had a dentist grind down her teeth to look more like a poor woman than the rich American she was. She also dyed her hair gray. She made contact with the French resistance and mapped drop zones, found safe houses, and helped the Jedburgh team, a joint Allied operation to drop agents into occupied Europe to conduct sabotage after the Allied invasion of Normandy. She trained resistance forces to do guerrilla warfare and reported her findings until troops took over her network. Before the Normandy invasion, she called in airdrops, and the resistance fighters blew up bridges and sabotaged trains. In one OSS report, Virginia's team was credited with derailing freight trains, blowing up 4 bridges, killing 150 Nazis, and capturing 500 more. They took back villages well before the Allied troops arrived deep in France. She continued to do spy work until the end of the war. With the war's end in 1945, she returned to America. Virginia received a Distinguished Service Cross from American General William Joseph Donovan in 1945 for her activities. She was the only civilian woman to receive such an honor in the Second World War. President Truman wanted the award to be public, but Virginia did not want a public ceremony, saying she was still operational and most anxious to get busy. And so Hall's mother was the only outsider present at the private ceremony. Virginia was made an honorary member of the Order of the British Empire and received the Croix de Guerre from France. The most decorated female civilian of World War II never shared her contributions with the world. She said she kept her silence because many of my friends were killed for talking too much. She married a fellow OSS agent in 1950, and in 1951 she joined the Central Intelligence Agency, which had been formed from the OSS in 1947. Virginia was an analyst on French paramilitary affairs and worked side by side with her husband. Virginia Hall's story was first related in a 2005 book by Judith Pearson called Wolves at the Door, the true story of America's greatest female spy. Miss Pearson details many of Virginia Hall's greatest exploits. More recently, there were 3 books published last year, and now there's talk of making a movie. There is a display to her in the OSS Gallery of the CIA Museum in Langley, Virginia. Virginia Hall retired in 1966 to a farm in rural Maryland. She was a spy's spy and never spoke publicly about her activities. Even many of her close family members were unaware of her World War II exploits. She passed away in 1982 at the age of 76. It is ironic, if good spycraft, that she was able to become one of the most dangerous spies of the Second World War because she was a person who looked anything but dangerous. But it is more ironic that her extraordinary wartime contributions were almost lost to history because the limping lady never gave up being a spy.
You know, Virginia Hall, very clearly a singular person. Even in the early parts of this story where you're talking about, how she was in high school and stuff like that. I mean, clearly she was...
Walked her own path.
She was going to be who she was going to be, and there was no one that was going to stop her.
There was no one's going to stop her. Yeah. I mean, you can't, and with a prosthetic leg, it's just an absolutely extraordinary story. We've had a few of these, of people that really overcame obstacles. But the idea that Klaus Barbie thought that his whole career could be made if he could catch this one spy.
That limping Canadian.
It's this woman with one leg. Yeah. It's she's an absolutely extraordinary story. It feels like it would be so extraordinary to know her, except that she never talked to anyone about. She maintained her spycraft to the bitter end. And so even her family didn't know the whole story, which is just extraordinary.
It's something else. And I guess, that speaks to the kind of person she was. She did her work. She was not looking for praise and fame by it. She did what she did because she felt that was right. And
she believed in the cause, and she had to overcome. But I mean, it's a little bit different for her because when the British Secret Service picked her out, it was because, and they were thinking this way, the Germans would never suspect her. They would never suspect this, this slight one-legged woman of being a spy, and that worked for a very long time. I think it took the Germans quite a long time before they would believe that she was really running the network, and that she hikes out through the Alps
on one leg,
on one leg. Cuthbert's giving me trouble. They're like, well, kill him.
That's one of the most entertaining parts. They're like, if Cuthbert gives you trouble, eliminate him.
Eliminate him. Yeah, they're all cutthroat. So she's. I mean, it is one of those absolutely amazing stories. But I mean, if you just imagine how intelligent she had to be. To do all the stuff that she was doing, I would imagine she'd be an extraordinary person to meet because the fact that she's doing that behind enemy lines and keeping those networks going. I mean, those people really took extraordinary risks because the Germans would not treat you well if they were to catch you. It wouldn't be a quick death, and that she just continued to befuddle them and fool them and pull the Mata Hari stuff where she would just dye her hair and they would completely
lose her.
Just she'd walk right by them.
It's really, really amazing. But I was thinking about that too. I mean, she didn't have she had maybe a handful of weeks of training when they picked her up out of Spain. This was not somebody who had trained her whole life in spycraft. She essentially just came to this
she had been in the
naturally.
diplomatic service.
That's true.
Or been in the consular service. So but I mean, she was also just clearly. She was class president and all that. She was just clearly someone who was very, very intelligent and knew how to take advantage of it. And that's again. I mean, I just can't imagine meeting this woman. I think that she's probably one of the most impressive women in history. Just the stuff that she was doing is just. I mean, there's don't have. Setting aside the fact that she was a woman and missing half a leg, which all around were things you wouldn't think of as being in the OSS or in the special service or anything like that. It's just that what she had to be doing in order to keep that all going. I mean, it's amazing. And so it's an extraordinary story, and it's a story that deserves to be told. It's so amazing that it was kind of left hidden until the first books didn't come out until the 90s?
2005, I think, is actually what you said.
2005.
And
before we.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's wild because she. I mean,
imagine finding out your granny, served you cookies.
Was
was the most hunted spy in Europe. During the
she
war.
was doing it at a time that early period in France when she was there in 1941. As the war went on and it became clear that the Allies were probably going to come through, suddenly everyone was in the resistance. But in those
she was there.
In those early days, it was hard. People, I mean, when Germany trounced through France, there was a lot of belief that Germany was unstoppable, that there really might never be a free France again. And it was pretty powerful that she went in there anyway, in probably the most dangerous time, in a place when she couldn't count
most dangerous places.
She couldn't count on help from everybody, and there came.
You don't know anybody could betray you for any number of reasons. Yeah, and she lived through all that. Just extraordinary life too, and that's. Very few people could tell that tale, and even fewer could do it and not tell the tale.
Yeah, never talk about it. There's a lot more to her story. Of course, we have a fairly short amount of time to tell it. There's a point where they invite her to this meeting, and she chooses not to go, and they're all captured, and she's one of the only still active assets in France, and the only one apparently who could get. For a while, information actually out of the country, and that's the caution and the brilliance that it takes to be that level of, first of all, just competent. I mean, it's really quite incredible.
And, I mean, the spycraft in it, I mean, just is incredible that she's able to sneak around and do radio and all sorts of things at a time when that's what everybody's looking for. Yeah, but I mean, just to throw on a disguise and be able to successfully do that, and she really did take advantage of the fact that she didn't look like a spy, and she knew she didn't look like a spy.
It was,
and she's quite attractive too. Yeah. I'm sure she made use of that. I'm sure that she charmed German sentries while she walked right by them. Yeah.
That's one of the you talked about in the beginning of that there was that that kind of misogyny, this idea that women aren't smart enough to do that was part of what the
that's
and she took advantage.
Why they recruited her.
She uses the brothels and stuff like that. I mean, those were places where you gather a lot of intelligence.
You're probably getting a ton of intelligence out of there, and the women working there might be much more willing to talk to you than talk to a male spy. And she the story is she was a hero. Yeah. She's someone who went where she didn't have to go. She did it because she believed in the cause. She certainly hated the Nazis. And so she did something. I mean, if she had never done this, if she had gone, if she'd escaped and gone back to the U.S., no one would ever have said a word. And she chose instead to go into danger and to work for a cause that she believed in and risk her life every single day when she did that. And that's absolutely, again, heroism.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's no other way to put it.
I can't imagine going, after she leaves France and then she goes back.
Mm-hmm. She goes back. She gets out of France and then she goes back. Yeah. Well, no, she gets out of France. She goes back. She gets chased out of France. Has to limp out across the Alps, and she still goes back.
Still goes back again. Yeah. I mean, she was very much clearly committed to the cause, and at whatever cost. She's certainly.
I would suspect she was also pretty ruthless.
Oh my God. Yeah. she must have been to do what she did. It required quite a bit. I probably required more than I could give, to be honest.
It probably required more than they were even able to tell the story. But we got to hear a good chunk of the story, and to know that the limping woman was real and who she was is because for a long time they didn't know that. We didn't know that. We just knew the Germans were chasing this woman. We didn't have any idea who she was.
She could have been made up for all we knew at that point, and it turns out that she was a real person, and I mean a bit larger than
life. I'm going to run a spy network in front of everybody who sees you, walk with a limp.
Yeah.
And that way, if they come, you can run away and they won't think it's you.
That's one of the, she would have been fairly recognizable because of that.
You would think, yeah.
And she's able to.
She must have had a good prosthetic. Yeah, she must have had a pretty Cuthbert must have been pretty impressive for the day. Yeah, because you would think at that point that would make you easy to identify.
But she,
of course, I have no idea how many people were using prosthetics.
That's true. I don't know but she even, she ground down her teeth so that she would look more like a peasant. And that's quite a sacrifice.
Yeah, that's I don't know if I would want to.
I don't think I would damage my teeth for something like that, but I also I don't know if I would.
It's a different generation.
Yeah.
We're also not facing
That's true. We're not.
The Nazi peril is not quite the same as it once was.
We're not faced with Nazi Europe, which again is part of what makes her story so incredible, is that she was faced with that, and it's not like, I mean, they very well knew what the dangers of going against Nazi Germany was and the Gestapo, and she went ahead and did it anyway. And she knew she was in danger the whole time, and clearly she took her own safety very seriously. It's why she decided to walk out of the country over a mountain. But it's every single day she had.
Well, she was saying so many of her friends died because they were careless, and so she had learned that lesson, and she just wouldn't be.
She wouldn't be, and she never was. Gosh, she didn't say a word about it for 50, 60 years.
But this is everything that the History Guy is about. Yeah. Talk about history that deserves to be remembered, that was on the verge of being forgotten, and that everybody can learn from. I mean, what an extraordinary person.
It makes you wonder, how many people lived extraordinary lives like this and never said anything.
Yeah, and we don't know, and their name was lost.
And that there are people
there's so much heroism has been lost to history that we have to appreciate the pieces that we find. Because you're right, for every Virginia there were 5, 6, 8 those same spies that didn't make it out of there.
Yeah, and we might not
quite a few of them
know their stories at all, and they were certainly just as brave and heroic. And it's why we have to. You're right. It's why we have to treasure what we can get and remember that there's so many other people whose stories this kind of represents.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Forgotten History, and if you did, you can find more on our website, thehistoryguy.com. We release podcasts every 2 weeks, so stick around if you want to hear more podcasts of Forgotten History. You can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Patreon. You can even get a personalized message from the History Guy himself on Cameo.